What's up, everyone? I know it's been a while. I'm hoping to get back into the swing of things, and I've started going live on a little bit more of a regular basis. I had to take a break this week, but the something that I've started doing is called an apologetics workshop, and it's where I'm looking at different arguments that are very popular within the apologetic sphere and exploring them, talking about what they're designed to do, where they fail, how to make sure that you're presenting it as well as you can, and some of the common objections and maybe even responses to those objections. And this was actually requested of me by Ogar Debates to go over the uh, modal argument from contingency. Now, there's different contingency arguments that are out there, but this one uses modal logic. Now, modal logic is using a particular framework to argue for the truth value or the existence of a thing. And the way that modal logic works is it is based on possible world language. Now, possible worlds does not mean that that world actually exists. What it's trying to get at, as put forth by Leibniz, who's one of the proponents of this framework, is this, for example, the statement, the door is closed. Now, it just so happens that it is true in this world, the actual world that we are currently existing in, that the door actually is closed. But there is nothing inherently contradictory with the phrase the door is closed, where if there was another world or another way that reality could be where the statement is now the door is open, there's nothing inherently contradictory between those two statements. Versus, let's say something like the bachelor is unmarried. So we have the bachelor is unmarried, and that is true. Here we go. The bachelor is unmarried, and that statement is true. And this is a necessary truth because it is true regardless of the framework of the world that we're operating within. Because if I was to say the bachelor is married, well, that is now a contradiction. Therefore, it is impossible for this statement to be true in any configuration of the world. Therefore, this is what Leibniz would call a necessary truth. So why do I bring all of this up? Because the important thing to understand about arguments using the modal logical structure is when they're talking about a possible world, they are not talking about in like the Marvel cinematic universe of many worlds existing. No, it's just, hey, if I was to have everything be exactly the same except for this one thing, does that imply a contradiction? If the answer is no, then that is a contingent truth or a contingent being versus a necessary truth or a necessary being. So that leads into the question of, well, what is a contingent truth or a contingent being and a necessary being? Similar to a contingent truth or a contingent proposition and a necessary truth or a necessary proposition, a contingent being is a being that could have failed to exist. There's nothing inherently contradictory with the way reality is where that thing no longer exists. For example, if I no longer exist, there is nothing contradictory about that statement. Because it could be the case that I, as an individual, failed to exist, yet the world would still continue on even without me existing. Versus, say, something more fundamental, which is what this argument is attempting to demonstrate the need of this necessary thing, where it doesn't matter the configuration of the world or how you try to describe it to negate or remove this thing from your worldview or your explanation of the world leads to a inherent contradiction, which means that this has to exist regardless of the orientation of the world. So with the preamble out of the way, let's go ahead and get right into the argument itself. So the way that the argument goes is the first premise, there is a possible world. We're going to call this world W, where every contingent thing has an explanation for why it exists. P2, the totality of all other contingent beings in W is itself contingent. P3, therefore, there is an explanation for this totality. P4, this explanation must involve a necessary being. P5, therefore, a necessary being exists in W. P6, if a necessary being exists in a possible world, then it exists in all possible worlds. P7, therefore, a necessary being exists. P8, this necessary being is God. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. So this was the argument as it was presented to me, and I'm going to go through each of the different premises now and provide a little bit of the explanation, justification, and some of the responses and counter responses when applicable. So starting with the very first one, there exists a possible world W where every contingent thing has an explanation for why it exists. So this is not necessarily saying that this world is one where every contingent thing has an explanation for why it exists. Rather, it is stating that it is possible that there exists such a world. And it could be the case that this is that world. We don't know yet, but it could be the case. Now, in premise 2, before I get into premise 2, so in premise 1, one of the ways that someone might be able to counter this is try to say, oh, but there are brute contingencies. At that point, a brute contingency doesn't necessarily respond to premise 1. Now, the difference between, like, say, a brute fact and a brute contingent fact is a brute fact could be either contingent or necessary depending on the nature of this particular fact. But a brute contingent fact or a brute contingent thing is something that could have failed to exist yet has no explanation for it. That's why premise 1 is presented in the way that it is it's stating that there has to exist, or there does exist, at least one configuration of all things that all these things have an explanation for it, where there are no brute contingent facts. And the proponent of someone who holds to a brute contingent fact has to acknowledge this because the very nature of the brute fact being contingent relies on it failing to exist. So it doesn't exist in every possible world. There are possible worlds where this brute contingency does not exist. So because of that, premise 1 follows through regardless whether you hold to a brute contingency or not, because it is not claiming that this is that world. It is simply saying there exists at least a possible world where all contingencies have an explanation that there are no proved contingencies. Premise 2. The totality of all other contingent beings in W is itself contingent. So what is this saying? It is saying that the totality is in and of itself a thing that could have failed to exist. Why? Because if one of these things in W did not fail to exist, now it's a new totality. And so because of that, that totality is contingent because it could have failed to exist by the very fact that it could have been different. Premise 3 follows from premise 1 and premise 2, therefore there is an explanation of this totality. Now, premise 4 seems like a bit of a jump. This explanation must involve a necessary being. The reason why there isn't this jump that might appear on first notice is if you just substitute a contingent thing to try to explain the totality, well, that is now a part of W where every contingent thing has an explanation. So that contingent thing you try to insert to explain the totality now also needs an explanation. So nothing is actually being resolved. I did a video on infinite vicious regress, which I'll have linked in the description below, that goes into a little bit, but that is what is happening here if you try to insert a contingent thing as the explanation. That is why there must be a necessary thing in order to have the explanation of W, the totality of all things. So now we're into P5. Therefore, a necessary being exists in W. If a necessary being exists in a possible world, then it exists in all possible worlds. And this is where a lot of people, I think, get tripped up. This is not saying that there exists an actual world according to this, but rather, the way that modal logic works is it's saying is if there is a necessary truth or a necessary thing or something that is necessary, and it exists or it is the case in one explanation or one possible world, then it has to be the case in every possible world, even if it's not directly visible to us. So, for example, to use that married bachelor, even if there was a world where marriage did not exist, it would still be the case that bachelors are unmarried men. Or if there are no men, or there's even if you were in a world that did not have any living thing, that even just male or no males or no females, that statement, bachelors are unmarried, is still necessarily true, even if there's nothing there to actualize it. Because it is true in this world, and it's a necessary truth, it is true in all worlds, even if there's nothing there to actualize that truth. The question then gets into, does that apply to beings, which I'll be delving into a little bit more, but that's what this argument is trying to say, is that because there exists one world, or there's one possibility that necessitates the need of a necessary being, then it doesn't matter what the worldview is, that being necessarily exists, and the rest of it just follows. Therefore, a necessary being exists. I don't like the phrasing of P8 and of P8 specifically. This necessary being is God, but it's better understood if it's more of this necessary being is what is meant by God. Therefore, God exists. Now, one of the most common critiques of this argument is this then falls into modal collapse. So what is modal collapse? Modal collapse is, we're going to call this contingent thing P. So we have P. P requires something else in order for it to be the case. We're going to call this n. So P requires n. Let me see. Or I guess it should be backwards. N leads to P. So n leads to P. But because n necessarily and always will exist, and because the presence of n leads to the existence of P, this means that P, wherever n is, P also is. But because n is in all possible worlds and couldn't have failed to exist, that means P is now unable to fail to exist. It has to exist as well. And so the criticism is that now everything is necessary. But this is doing an equivocation error, which I'll be getting into in a little bit. But this is usually the argument done, especially for Christians who want to say, hey, God freely created the world. God is the reason for the world. But then the atheist or the critic comes in and says, well, if God is the necessary thing, and he couldn't have failed to exist, and the world comes from God, then that means that the world couldn't have failed to exist because it had to have come from God, from this necessary thing. And because of this, I'm not sure if I appreciate this particular argument. I do think that there are ways to respond to it in this capacity, but especially as a Christian, you might want to stay away from this particular argument, especially due to the fact that as Christians, we do believe that God freely created the world. And you can't necessarily show a free agent through this method. I am personally not a fan of using arguments that have implications to attributes of a God that I don't believe in. It feels dishonest to me and it feels underhanded, and I don't know, it's just not something that I personally agree with. Any argument that I try to use, I always make sure that it does lead to entailments of the position that I actually hold. Even if it's not immediately obvious at the moment I'm making that argument, I am never going to present an argument that is going to have for example, God that necessarily creates. I believe in a God that freely creates, so any argument that I present, I want it to have that ability or entailment of God has that freedom to create. Because otherwise, what's going to end up happening is you're going to have to counter a very foundational point that you had made earlier, the very thing that proved in this case that God exists. And now the whole worldview comes tumbling down. But there is a ray of hope even for this argument for the Christian theist, but you still are going to want to be very careful in using this argument. The reason why I say that is because there are two types of necessity. Thomas Aquinas describes this as a thing that gets its necessity from something else. So we're going to call that CN for contingently necessary. And then you have a thing that doesn't get its necessity from something else. It is its own necessity. So why is this important? Because even though the world is contingently necessary, so we have the world contingently necessary, God is not contingently necessary. So even though it could be the case, if the modal collapse is true, that with the presence of God, the world could not have failed to exist. The world is still dependent on God, and so it necessarily follows from God, but it's still contingent on God, because if there was no God, then the world would have failed to exist. It receives its necessity from something else. And Thomas Aquinas, or the God that we are trying to argue for, is this something that has its own necessity and doesn't receive it from something else. So rather than being a defeater for theism in general. The modal cosmological argument isn't afraid of a modal collapse because, yes, the world is now couldn't have failed to exist, but it's still receiving that attribute from something else. And if that source wasn't there, then it still would have failed to exist. That's what this argument is trying to do, is to show that the world cannot be its own explanation. It's basically trying to argue against a necessarily existing world. Now, whether it succeeds in that or not is going to get in a lot more in depth. But if we accept this, if we accept premise one, there is a possible world where every contingent thing has an explanation for why it exists, then the world itself cannot be, because of these, the world itself cannot be that self-explanatory thing. Now, with all of that being said, the reason why I, as a Christian, would recommend fellow Christians not using this argument is due to the fact that it does imply, heavily at least, that the world is not freely created by God, that God necessarily had to create the world, which is contrary to the Christian faith. If you are not a Christian, or you don't hold to the Abrahamic faith traditions, this argument can work as long as you understand that there is this difference between contingently necessary, as I'm calling it, and true necessary. Because the thing that you're trying to get to is that there is a truly necessary thing. Now, does this argument do a good enough job in explaining why it can't be the world? That's going to be trickier. And that's going to be where you're going to have to do justifications for P1, as well as key 3. If you're able to move past this part here and provide justifications for why the totality in and of itself is contingent. Actually, I guess the biggest one is just P2. If you're able to provide sufficient justification for P2, where your interlocutor accepts P2 as true, then the rest of it follows. If they don't, you're going to need to provide justification. You better have a really, really good understanding on the justification for this. So this is the area that I'm going to say that for a non-Abrahamic faith believer, this is the premise that you're going to need to shore up and do research on to make sure that you are doing it to the best of your ability. Otherwise, the person that you're speaking to can just say, no, the totality of itself can be necessary. It doesn't have to be contingent. And then the rest of the argument falls apart. Christians need to be worried about the modal collapse. I don't think, or I should say, the Abrahamic faith needs to be worried about the modal collapse. Is there an answer even with the modal collapse? Possibly. But I don't see it, and especially for the dialogue amongst the layperson, the justification required is going to be far too deep for that to be easily conveyed in a quick, TikTok video, YouTube short, online debate, or anything like that. But as far as the modal collapse for the Christian believer, that, even with the distinction of contingently necessary and truly necessary, you still want to be careful with that, because by acknowledging that the world is contingently necessary, even though it theoretically could fail to exist, it seems to imply that it absolutely could not fail to exist. Now, whether or not respondents of God's free will and things like that can resolve this, that's going to then lead into issues with divine simplicity if that's something you hold to, aseity. There's so many nuanced positions within Christianity that are put into tension due to that modal collapse, and that's why the modal collapse criticism has succeeded for as long as it has. But it is not a universally successful criticism, because if you do hold to a deistic kind of God that necessarily created the world, then this argument works because you're not worried of that modal collapse. Um, but that's all I've got today. There is something that I've been wanting to do is just more on exploring these types of arguments. So if you've got a recommendation on an argument you'd like me to look at, I do have videos already on Pascal's wager and um, Anselm's ontological arguments. But if there are other arguments that you'd like me to look into, as well as video topics that you'd like me to explore to help further this interfaith dialogue, feel free to let me know. Leave a comment. Um, you know, Give a like, share, subscribe. That helps the channel grow. I'm trying to do a lot more with this, but in order to do that, I definitely need your help because I don't know what you guys want. If you liked this layout, I'm trying different things to help make sure that it's not just me talking. Um, but yeah, leave a like, share, follow, and subscribe if you haven't already. And looking forward to doing this again.